Thank you. I do want to take a moment to thank Xingying and Yaqing for inviting me to the workshop and for the local organizers for the wonderful job they have done. It's been a great pleasure here. I also want to thank all of you for coming to this talk. So my background was in computational theoretical linguistics, but for some reason, I landed in the Department of Applied Linguistics for my first job. So I've been working with my colleagues on more applied topics, but still trying to connect to linguistic theories and the computational analysis. So this might be an example of this kind of connection. I hope it can still be interesting to some of you. So I'll start with a very brief discussion of the conceptualization of linguistic complexity. There has been a lot of talk on the definition of this concept, but broadly we can think of this as either absolute or relative. I will be focusing on the absolute part of this. So when we talk about absolute complexity, we're talking about the number or variety or elaborateness of the structural elements within linguistic units, kind of out of context. But we can also look at relative complexity in terms of the degree to which something may be hard to use or acquire, such as using frequency information and other kinds of proxies. We can analyze complexity at many different kinds of levels, including morphological, lexical, syntactic, causal, and I will focus on syntactic complexity today. Okay, there were a lot of tools. So methodologically, there have been a lot of discussion in terms of how can we operationalize syntactic complexity. And people see this as a multi-dimensional construct. And as you can see, there are many different kinds of tools. Some of them include hundreds of different measures. They all strive to assess complexity by looking at different kinds of structures, structural levels, structural subtypes. A good example of these kinds of tools is the Bible tagger, which will do some kind of a tagging of a text at the lexicogrammatic level and then compute a lot of different kinds of measures of normalized frequencies of different kinds of things. I will show you a table summarizing some of the most prominent features from this tool. Cometrics may be familiar to some of you. This tool was designed initially to analyze the cohesion and coherence of text, but they also include a number of tools for analyzing syntactic complexity. Mean dependency distance has been considered as a very effective measure of complexity as well, as proposed by Professor Liu and has been pursued for quite some time now. I myself also has a tool called L2SCA, which is a tool that provides 14 large-grained indices of complexity. And Kyle, 2016, developed a very comprehensive tool that provides a large number of very fine-grained clausal and phrasal measures of complexity. So we'll share some tables. We'll not go over the details of them. So here you have a table summarizing some of the indices from the Bible tagger that were able to discriminate a number of different kinds of things, including spoken versus written text, TOEFL essay scored at higher or lower levels, and also integrated and independent TOEFL writing tasks. So as an example, they found that, for example, adverbs are used more frequently in speaking than in writing, more by lower scored essays than higher scored essays, and also used more frequently in independent versus integrated writing. So we have a lot of different kinds of lexicogrammatic features, and they have been found to be more prominent or less prominent in different kinds of language usage scenarios. Here is a summary of the measures in Cometrics. You will see at the bottom, you have a number of things which look very similar to what we saw just now. So a density of different kinds of patterns of use. But up there, we have a number of kind of unique things. And I will mention just one of them because I will be talking about this measure in a moment. So the first measure says mean number of words before the main verb. A sentence can start with something like a pronoun, then I say, I am happy here. So you only have one word before the main verb, which is very straightforward. But you can also have a lot of other things before the main verb, such as a subordinate clause. So in terms of complexity, we think of things like that as being a little harder to process because you have to maintain some information in your working memory before you come to the main message. So here is a summary of the 14 tools and measures in my own tool. I did not invent any of the measures. Rather, when I read a book-length review of complexity measures used in second language writing research, up until I think the early 2000s, I thought it was very interesting because these were the kinds of analysis that second language writing researchers were very interested in, but there was no tool at the time to automate them. So I spent some time producing a tool that would automate these kinds of analysis, but they're kind of large grained because they do not really differentiate very specific structures. And then on the other end of fine grainedness, we have this tool TASC, which some of you may be familiar with, developed by Kyle. So this tool differentiates a lot of very specific types of clauses and phrases and dependents. So here we have a table summarizing the types of phrases and types of dependents. So an example of a measure from this tool will be something like number of verbal modifiers per passive nominal subject. So you take something from the lower part of the table and divide that by something from the upper part of the table, you can see that you can imagine there will be a lot of different kinds of measures. And they all of them will measure the usage of a very specific kind of structure in a particular kind of phrase. So we can think of the measures here as on the other end of how fine-grained they can be. So what are applied linguists doing with them, right? We have on the one hand, we have a lot of discussion about how should we define and operationalize and automate the analysis of these kinds of things. On the other hand, there has been a lot of studies on examining the relationship between some measure of syntactic complexity and something else, such as its relationship to readability. You can think of, you probably can imagine scholars doing research in machine learning, trying to figure out what kinds of features can be very useful in determining the proficiency level text may be appropriate for. We also look at whether certain kinds of learner or task variables will affect the complexity of the writing. For example, depending on your proficiency level or your first language background, you may produce more or less of different kinds of things. And also depending on whether you're writing for a narrative genre or augmentative genre, even the same writer will produce different kinds of things. So we try to understand the variation as an effect of different kinds of learner and task variables. We also have a lot of interest in understanding the relationship between these kinds of measures and writing quality, both in terms of building automated essay scoring systems, but also in terms of in-depth understanding of the relation between specific kinds of measures and writing quality. Scholars in second language writing, second language development to acquisition also have interest in understanding how learners develop over time through pedagogical inventions or naturalistically. So tracking what kinds of things may co-develop or compete with each other, what kinds of things take a longer time than other things to develop, and so on and so forth. In academic writing research, there is also interest in understanding variation across different kinds of registers or genres or disciplines. So all this is to say that there has been a lot of research. I give you some examples of my own research here, but of course, there are many, many other scholars who have done an incredible amount of research on these topics. At the same time, you can also see that most of the studies here that are summarized here are based on forms. So we are basically looking at what kinds of forms are used with what kind of frequency. So it's based on forms. So in this paper, in today's talk, I will try to kind of explain why I think it may be important to also look at the functions of these complex forms for important reasons. So in this paper, I talk about two things. One is the meaning dimension of complexity analysis, and the other is function dimension. So I will focus on the function dimension today. But very briefly, by meaning, I mean, so another important dimension of complexity analysis is lexical complexity. So similarly, there has been a lot of measures for lexical sophistication, lexical diversity. But interestingly, we have also been primarily concerned with forms. So for example, when we use frequency or corpus reference corpus frequency as a proxy of lexical sophistication, we're talking about whether a word is highly or not so highly frequent in a large scale corpus. Then we will say this word is relatively easy or not so easy. However, I argue in this paper that it is important, and I would think this makes sense to all of you, that it is important to also look at the specific meanings or senses with which these words are used, right? So you could use a very high frequency word, but with a very low frequency meaning, which may entail a very in-depth understanding of the knowledge of the word. So I argue about that in this paper as well. But more importantly, for today, I will explain what I mean by a functional turn in this kind of research. So, and the reason behind this was really, I told you a lot about the kinds of formal analysis we have done. And every time I go to a conference where there were a lot of teachers of writing, they were asking me, so what does all these findings mean for me as a teacher? I cannot just tell my students to write increasingly more complex, right? These results are not always directly interpretable for teachers, even though we know, for example, that higher scored essays will tend to use more of these kinds of things. But novice academic and L2 writers cannot just increase complexity everywhere, right? They need to know where and how and for what function should they use them. And there are also still places where you should use simple structures, right, instead of complex structures. So it's important to know that quantitatively, yes, there is a correlation between higher complexity and then higher proficiency and higher quality of writing, but that's just a correlational relationship. We need to be aware of why are expert writers using them and for what purposes and where. So to push this kind of research forward, we started a project. This was our first project on this topic, trying to look at the rhetorical functions of complex sentences in academic writing. So we used the corpus of social science research article introductions. I will skip maybe this part, but this was a kind of a justification of why we thought we need to do this kind of analysis. The same idea that we need to look at why writing experts would use different kinds of complex structures and where. So asking two questions here. The first one is, are there differences in the syntactic complexity of sentences that realize different rhetoric functions in social science research article introductions? And if yes, what are those differences? And the second one is, what rhetoric functions are realized through the most complex sentences? So these two are related, but the first one is looking at if we just categorize all the sentences in academic writing by their rhetoric function, and then compare their complexity, are we going to see differences? The purpose of this is to show that if there is no difference, it means academic writers just make their writing complex everywhere. It doesn't matter what I'm writing for. But if there is significant differences, then it means that they do actually vary. They use more simple structures when they are doing certain kinds of things, but they do something else when they're writing for other kinds of purposes. The second one is trying to extract a subset of sentences that we can say are complex. So as a learner, of course, on the one hand, we need to learn to be able to produce them, right? If you are not able to produce complex structures, you cannot do anything about it. But once you are able to produce it, the next step for us is to help them see that you should become more purposeful in choosing to use them. So here we are extracting a subset of complex sentences and show where are they distributed and what are they being used for. That's the second thing. So here is a brief summary of the corpus that we compiled. We collected 600 research articles across 6 social science disciplines, anthropology, and so on and so forth. So we had 100 texts for each discipline. They spanned over a 5-year period. We gathered 5 top-tier journals in each of the 6 disciplines by looking at the impact factors and also consulting 2 experts from the corresponding departments of these disciplines at my university. And these were all general journals in the disciplines, not specialized. So that may not be the most important part here. But so we have a corpus that we hope represent academic writing within the field of social science. And then we annotated all of the 600 samples manually using this framework of rhetorical moves and steps. So rhetorical move and step, if you're not very familiar with it, is a framework of annotating rhetorical chunks in terms of what is the purpose of this chunk of text in this piece of writing. So as an example, when you're writing an introduction, we do start by establishing the territory of our research. We talk about why a particular problem or sub-problem has been of interest or is important, right? And then we provide some generalization of what others have done. So what do we know already? And then we talk about limitations of previous research or gaps, or things we need to do now, right, as new things emerge. And then we will talk about what are we going to do to actually solve the problem, address the limitation, or fill the gap, and so on and so forth. So within each of these moves, we can do a number of smaller steps that help us construct this kind of a purpose. And if you write an instruction not doing any of these things or not doing all of them, we feel like something is missing. So a good example is especially for L1 Chinese writers, we tend to have a long introduction, and yet at the end of that long introduction, you do not know what the author is going to do. they do not tell you the purpose of the current research. Rather, they provide a very lengthy discussion of the background. And you only get to know what they're going to do in the methodology section, which creates a problem. And so it may be obvious to some of you that, of course, we do it this way. But actually, if you read a lot of, as an editor of a journal, right, or reviewers of journal articles, we realize it is not the case that we will do that. But so what we did actually then in the corpus is that we will segment text into sentences like this. And then we manually annotate every sentence using a tag from the framework. So this was a very painstaking process involving 7 researchers over a course of 7 to 8 months. There were very lengthy discussion of what are we going to do with these seemingly problematic sentences and what new text do we have to add and so on and so forth. So the paper does discuss how the team came together through discussion and iterations of work to reach a good enough agreement on these kind of annotations. And then once we have this corpus annotated, we then analyzed every single sentence using 5 measures. Of course, this is as a first study, we're not by any means to say that these are the only 5 measures we should look at. Of course not, right? But there were, if not thousands, hundreds of measures that we can look at. So we try to pick 5 measures that represent different structural levels. So sentence length, for example, some may argue that's not important. But on the other hand, I think sentence is still an informative unit for information organization, right? And then we look at normalizations, which is kind of at the bottom of fine grainness. We know that normalizations are highly important in scientific and academic writing. We also look at both finite and non-finite dependent clauses, and then we have left embeddedness. So this is more maybe kind of illustrative rather than, so illustrating that there is a lot of value we hope to show in this study to look at the relation between rhetoric functions and complex structures. And so we analyzed every sentence using these 5 measures. We have a table, we have a summary in table 4 summarizing the distribution. And then for research question number 2, we decided on the 3rd quartile as a threshold we would use to consider whether a sentence is complex or not based on a particular measure. So for example, if a sentence has 33 or more words, this will be a complex sentence in terms of sentence length. It contains 9 or more left words before the main verb. It is considered complex for left embeddedness. So that's for research question number 2. And then in relation to the 2 questions we asked, the first analysis we did was to just look at, whether across the 5, across different rhetoric moves and steps, do we see differences in their complexity, right? So in table 5, we summarize the rhetoric steps that were significantly less or more complex for the 5 measures than the group as a whole. So for example, for sentence length, we have several steps that were significantly shorter than the others. For normalization, we have some longer, some shorter. So this table just shows that there is variation across different steps and moves in terms of complexity. And then in the second research question, we were trying to understand how are these complex sentences distributed, right? Do they tend to occur everywhere, or do they tend to occur more frequently in some versus other rhetoric steps? So I'll give you 2 examples. This one is for finite dependent clauses. We realize, that they occur more frequently in certain steps than in others. We do have an example here from a sentence in Applied Linguistics for stating research questions and hypotheses. So this one says, since speakers and listeners who, blah, 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 then that, and then who, then that, and that. So we see a very high frequency of these kinds of clauses in this kind of writing. And interestingly, some scholars have argued that the use of finite relative clauses is not really a good characterization of academic writing. Rather, they tend to be used more frequently speaking. Right? In academic writing, we tend to use more normalizations or complex noun phrases, but we see that they are still useful when, in this case, the writer was trying to be very precise in defining which kinds of people are we talking about, what kinds of language are we talking about. So when you are stating these kinds of things, you want to be highly specific so that you're not being vague or too general. It becomes useful. So another example is left embeddedness. We also, through this quantitative analysis identified steps that would attract more of these kinds of sentences, but I think it became clear with an example again. So we are comparing two sentences here. Even though we only pick two here, they're actually very representative. The first one is a sentence indicating a research gap or pointing out limitations in general. You will see it says, although a large economics literature, blah, 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 until the third line, it says less attention has been paid. So maybe you echo this when you are trying to say something not so positive about previous research. You don't just jump in right, say they are bad, right? We say something positive about their contributions and how they have inspired our work, but we need to do more. And it is actually very common. It is not an exceptional example in any way, but if you look at the second one, where you are announcing what the paper will do, we say this article analyzes, or the goal of this study is to, or we aim to. We don't put a lot, we can, of course, grammatically put anything before that, but we don't, right? Because we want to make our purpose of the current study very clear right away to the writer. So which means that even though if we compare left embeddedness across academic writing and other kinds of writing, we will see heavy usage of this kind of things. It doesn't mean that we simply make every sentence like that, right? We can see very clear differences. So along with this kind of research, we also examined whether there is interdisciplinary variation in terms of, okay, so you got scientists and social scientists and humanities scholars. So when they are criticizing each other's work, does one discipline tend to be more straightforward than another discipline, this kind of thing, or whether some things will hold across different disciplines. So in this study, we're trying to look at whether there is disciplinary variation in the relationship between complexity on the one hand and rhetoric purposes on the other hand. So we did find some interesting consistencies and also differences in this study. And then we took these findings to a classroom, right? When we were teaching a classroom of academic writers, these were graduate students taking the course over a summer, trying to improve on their ability to write for journal articles and their dissertation. So you would say that they actually had already a good command of grammar by this point, right? But this course, but some still came to the course thinking, I'm going to improve my vocabulary and the grammar. I just want to see what kinds of structures do academic writers use and how. So Elliot was my collaborator, one of my favorite collaborators. He's now an assistant professor, associate professor at the University of Memphis. So we made it very clear to them that you are not here to learn about complex structures on their own. Rather, our main goal is to help you understand what can they do for you and how can you, and how you should and how can you be more purposeful and intentional in choosing different kinds of structures, so that when you explain to someone, even when you make a mistake, you can explain to your advisor, to your reader, I'm trying to do this here. So I'm using this structure. And they told us before they came to the course, their professor will often tell them, this is not good, that's not good, this is good, but without explaining why that's the case. And they often thought it's just a grammatical problem and not a problem with good usage of certain kinds of structures. So at the end of the course, they felt that they could be more purposeful in choosing different kinds of structures for their writing. So let me look at time. Okay, so I will also share findings from a second study, which is on the pragmatic functions, right? We know that when we are talking about cumulative functions, there were so many different ways of, to talk about it. Rhetorical functions may be especially interesting in writing in particular, but also I think in many different genres. However, we do think of functions in diverse ways. So in this study, we're trying to look at functions from a slightly different perspective, pragmatic functions. And this paper is kind of related to the body of research on the relationship between linguistic features and writing quality. There has actually been many studies, generally within the field of automated essay scoring, but also just quantitative studies of linguistic features in different kinds of writing. So understanding what features can be predictive about writing quality. And I myself have also done quite a bit of study in this field. At the same time, we know that L2 pragmatics research through highly qualitative analysis, right, have shown that there is a link between the structures employed by L2 learners and the degrees of pragmatic appropriateness of their speech act performance. So for example, L1 speakers of English may say something like, I was thinking of doing this, as a suggestion, right? Or indicating what I would like to do. I was thinking of taking a day trip, maybe to Bled, right? But versus I will take a day trip to Bled. So L2 learners were found to be more likely to say, I will do something when they talk about their intentions. So there was a very strong commitment, but I was thinking of, there was mitigation. So, but that could change. And also, studies have shown that in oral requests by Japanese EFL learners, they tend to use more monoclausal things like, please, will you do this? Whereas L1 writers will tend to use, of course, there are always exceptions, things like, I was wondering if you could do something like this. So, but this was done qualitatively, basically, not through large scale analysis of a lot of learner corpus data. So we were trying to bridge these two kinds of things, right? On the one hand, we know a lot of features can be predictive of quality, but at the same time, are those features related to the pragmatic appropriateness or degrees of formality, degrees of politeness, right? Or are they just complex structurally? They do not contribute, or they are not related to this kind of thing? That's our main question. So there has been very little research trying to connect these two. We found one study that talked about differences in complexity among learners with a different L2 pragmatic competence. But this was not specifically connecting like why that is the case. It is rather taking two groups of people. So these people have been assessed as having a higher level of L2 pragmatic competence. And then if you look at the structures they produce, there is a difference, that kind of approach. So we have not seen any study investigating the effect of fine-grained indices on L2 writers' pragmatic appropriateness. So we're asking, we actually have two genres here. Because of the time, I will only talk about one of them. So I will talk about two of the four questions here. First one, we're asking which, if any, of the fine-grained clausal and noun phrase complexity indices predict the weighted proficiency levels of self-recommendation letters written by Chinese high school EFL learners. So that's a very traditional quantitative question. We're asking about relations between measures and quality. The second one was, were the fine-grained clausal and noun phrase complexity indices predicting quality? Are they also associated with differential degrees of politeness and formality among letters rated at different proficiency levels? So we had a corpus of 300 request letters and 300 self-recommendation letters produced by Chinese high school students sitting for the National Matriculation English Test. So very high-stake test in China for high school students trying to get into college. We drew data from 2 years, but we are looking at the second one here. So in 2019, students from Guangdong province were asked to write a self-recommendation letter applying for a volunteering position in the UK to work as a volunteer for international exhibitions. So they have to write an application letter to recommend themselves. And we chose these letter types because they have been important in high-stakes text. They have letter writing has received much less attention than narratives and argumentation, for example. And also these two kinds of letters have shared but also distinct purposes. And these letters were rated by two trained NMET raters. So these people have actually scored for the entrance exam for different kinds of things. As we can see, with very, very good interpretive reliability, we have a distribution of the essays by score level here, advanced, upper, intermediate, and intermediate for both letter types. So this is not so important for the purpose of the talk. I will focus more on what we actually did qualitatively. So in terms of the syntactic analysis, we utilized 10 fine-grained measures, several clausal and several noun phrase related ones. We have a summary of these measures here. Many of them were performed automatically using TAASSC, but we also had two that we done manually to make sure that they were accurate because the tool either did not do it or could not do it very accurately. But you will see that we have 4 very specific clausal types, right? Adverbial clauses, clause complements, restrictive and non-restrictive attributive clauses. And then for complex noun phrases, we're looking at different kinds of modifiers, and so on and so forth. So and then we have the statistical analysis trying to see whether there is a relationship between these measures and the quality rating. But that part is less interesting for today, right? And then once we have done that, then we did a follow-up qualitative analysis. Basically, we're trying to see if, for example, right, we found one of these features was predicting quality. Then our next question is it related to pragmatic appropriateness or is it not? Is it just structural? So to that end, we performed a number of analyses qualitatively. First of all, we extracted all the sentences in each letter expressing either unmodified explicit self-praise or modified explicit self-praise or implicit self-praise. So we have these three kinds of ways to praise oneself. And then for each of those, we also coded the actual strategy. So we have some examples on the next slide. For example, are you just saying, I'm really good at this? Or are you saying something else? And then once we have coded the pragmatic strategies, we then looked at whether the sentence also contained one of the features that were predictive. So does it contain, for example, an adverbial clause? Does it contain, or does it not contain any of those interesting things, right? And then we did some quantitative analysis to figure out whether among the different proficiency levels of letters, are they using these strategies with these kinds of structures with significant differences. So here is a summary of the quant analysis. And this analysis, basically the highlighted one, or the bolded ones are the ones that we found to be predictive of writing proficiency. So for example, adverbial clauses were found to be negatively correlated with writing quality. But on the other hand, you see that nominalizations is positively predicting writing quality. So we found these features to be predictive, and the unbolded ones were not really. And then in the qualitative analysis, you can see here in the first column, we have three bolded categories. So unmodified, explicit, self-praise, modified, and then implicit. For some of the three categories, we have strategies like ability statement, personality statement, comparison of self and others, and self-assertion. So these were based on L2 pragmatics research, of course, not invented by us. And then we also identified example sentences for each category. Of course, we exhaustively identified all of the relevant sentences. And for each one of them, we coded whether it contains any of the structures that were found to be predictive of writing quality. So with this analysis, we then performed an analysis like this. We were trying to understand, for example, if we look at clause complements expressing ability statements, so a structure related to a particular pragmatic strategy, what is the usage distribution or usage differences across writers with different proficiency level? So as an example, we see quite clearly that lower proficiency writers tended to use significantly more clause complements expressing ability statements like, I can do this, I'm able to do this. At the same time, we can see at the bottom of table 13, right, higher rated essays tend to use more if adverbial clauses expressing conditional promise. Something like, if I were successful in my application, I would bring my expertise in this, or I will help you do this, something along those lines, rather than I can do this for you, I will do this for you. Likewise, if you look at table 14, which summarizes the use of different kinds of complex modifiers, right, we do see that higher rated letters tended to use more different kinds of noun phrase modifiers. And we know that from previous research, especially research done by Biber and his colleagues, that complex noun phrases is a very good indicator of a degree of academic formality. Much more frequently in academic writing than in speaking or other kinds of writing, because they make information more compact, more precise, and also they convey a higher degree of formality than clausal structures. So we kind of summarize the main findings here. We see that adverbial clause per clause predicted both request and SR letter levels, but we know that actually if you use a lot of at the bottom, we also have clause complements. So we discussed how these kinds of structures were related to different kinds of strategies, right? It seems that it is not just a matter of the writers had a good command of the grammar, or they had a good command of the structures, but rather when they were using those kinds of structures, they were trying to do different kinds of things. And the kinds of things they were doing with them, as shown by previous L2 pragmatics research, were related to the degree of pragmatic appropriateness or formality or politeness. So which means that for teachers, we're not just trying to tell you, you need to help students have a better command of these kinds of structures, but rather in order to sound more polite or formal when necessary. These kinds of structures will help you express the same speech act, maybe in a more appropriate way, pragmatically. And also then in terms of complex noun phrases, I think this maybe is related to more the formality of it, right? So I hope that these two studies collectively have helped me illustrate and explain what I mean by a functional term in this kind of research, right? I continue to think that it is very important methodologically to identify valid and reliable ways of measuring complexity formally. But as we get increasingly better at doing that, it is useful to also, at least from a pedagogical perspective and applied perspective, to think about them not on their own, right? Anytime we are writing or speaking, we are using structures always with clear purposes. And these kinds of analysis can serve two purposes to me, right? First of all, they can continue to be useful in informing automated assessment of language. And on the other hand, they can help teachers have more tangible examples and findings and even resources to help the students become more, not just more proficient in grammatical usage, but also in purposeful usage of different kinds of structures. With this idea hopefully clear by now, of course, there are many things we need to do, right? First thing that we need to do is to look at tools that can automate annotation. Of course, this always starts with from this meeting, a conference, of course, I know, right? We don't start an analysis computationally right away. It always builds on a very solid understanding of the theoretical problem. But building on very good theoretical frameworks of analyzing functions, right? Commutative functions in any way, like rhetorical functions or pragmatic functions or other kinds of functions, it is important to be able to automate this kind of analysis so that we can perform large-scale analysis, generate resources. So one thing that we have tried to do is to explore whether we could fine-tune GPT models to automate the analysis of rhetoric moves and steps. So we did a study recently on that problem. We found that, but this was only on one discipline using one framework on one genre. It seems to be promising. Okay, and then this is my last slide. So we also think that once we're able to do this, we can, in addition to understanding quantitative development of learners, we can also look at whether and how they are becoming increasingly they are able to use increasingly more appropriate and effective form function mappings, as opposed to being able to use more complex structures over time. For teaching, we need materials that highlight the rhetoric and commutative functions of complex linguistic forms for teachers, so that when they're explaining why they are important, they are not just saying we need to use more complex structures. And finally, for assessment, I don't think that any rating rubric right now actually explicitly points out that we need to look at form function mappings in assessing language, even though I believe teachers and readers do that, right? But they always talk about the grammar on its own. So use a range of simple and complex structures accurately, as if that's a thing on its own. And then you need to have good ideas, but they kind of separate. So I think that a connection of these two might be more valid when we talk about the use of simple and complex structures. Okay, thank you so much.